Let's just remind you of our breaking news in the last few minutes. News coming from the Russian Civil Aviation Authority that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner mercenary group, was on the passenger list of a plane that has crashed in Russia. That news coming in from TASS news agency, Russian state media, which says that Yevgeny Prigozhin was on the passenger list of a plane that has crashed in Russia in a region outside Moscow, and that 10 people have died. We understand 10 people have been killed in a private plane crash north of Moscow. The Russian Civil Aviation Authority saying the Wagner mercenary leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was on the passenger list. Now, we understand the aircraft was en route from Moscow to St. Petersburg. All this information coming from TASS news agency at the moment. Of course, that is Russian state media. But this indeed would be very big news if this indeed is the case. Yevgeny Prigozhin, of course, was exiled to Belarus after that march on Moscow a couple of months ago. And we can bring in our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magne, who can give us more detail on this. Diana, thanks very much indeed for joining us. I understand you're joining us on the phone regarding this breaking news. We know very little at the moment, Diana, but if indeed this is the case, this is very big news indeed.
Yes, I mean, I wish I could give you more detail. I think that everything to do with Prigozhin, ever since his a public emergence as the leader of Wagner Group, has been extremely murky. And of course, ever since his march on Moscow in June, there have been questions about whether he could possibly survive, having essentially stood up against the regime. Only yesterday, we were talking about video of him popping up in what appears to be the Sahel in Africa, talking about how Wagner forces would bring freedom to the African people. And today, we understand from the Russian Aviation Agency that a plane has crashed north of Moscow in the Tver region, a private Embraer Legacy plane, and that all 10 on board are dead, and that Yevgeny Prigozhin was on the passenger list. So, I mean, I think it's very convenient for the Kremlin and for Russia to declare him dead. I suppose that a lot of people have been wondering, anticipating whether this would happen. And these are very preliminary details, as you were saying. But if this is the case, that Yevgeny Prigozhin has been killed in a crash, then that certainly serves the Kremlin's purposes, because he was not particularly useful to them, having essentially created the biggest problem for Vladimir Putin's presidency, that I can remember in the 23 years that Putin has been in power. And it is pretty extraordinary, but we await more detail.
Yeah, and as you say, Diana, Yevgeny Prigozhin, certainly there is no love lost between Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Kremlin since that rebellion when he marched on Moscow with Wagner fighters in response to what he believed was bad handling of the war in Ukraine. He then supposedly did a deal with Vladimir Putin and agreed to be exiled to Belarus. And of course, it now seems that he was on a plane in Russia heading from Moscow from St. Petersburg. It certainly does seem an extraordinary turn of events. Was there any indication that Yevgeny Prigozhin was in Russia?
Well, I mean, the last thing we saw of him, as I said, was video of him in the Sahel. And I think it was pretty clear that that was video of Prigozhin. Now, we don't know exactly when that was taped. It was probably pre-recorded and possibly released on the day that Sergei Lavrov was in South Africa for the BRICS summit as an attention-grabbing mechanism. So it is perfectly possible that Prigozhin could have returned back to Russia having recorded that. I have no doubt that the man in that video in Africa, and it was pretty clearly, African territory, was Prigozhin. But that's not to say that he hasn't returned. But the Russian Aviation Agency and the Russian Emergencies Ministry telling us that his name was on a list is I mean, at this stage, I would take it with a pinch of salt. We need slightly more confirmation than just that.